When beginning your watercolor, we're going to wet our palette a little bit. So get your brush nice and wet and just dab that wet brush on top of your paints to wake them up and make them ready for painting. I want you to keep in mind that we talked a lot about different values, and we're going to use a lot of water to make our paints lighter, and we're going to use a little bit more paint to make it appear darker. So to get started, I'm going to decide to start right on my tree. And when I traced my tree with glue, I also made some texture lines inside my tree. And you're going to start to see them right away when I lay my paint down. So I've got a nice wet brush. I get just a tap on top of my paint. I'm going to do a light wash of brown all over my tree to get started. You'll start to see those texture marks because the glue is resisting our paint. So it's pushing that paint away, saying, heck no paint, you can't sit on top of me. I'm going to fill up my whole tree just using some brown, and then I'll go back in and start to work on my values. Remember I said we can use water to make our paint lighter and add a little more paint to make it appear darker. So I tapped just on my brown paint here to make the one side of my tree a little bit darker than the other. What's cool about watercolor paint is that we can work in layers. So I can do just a little bit at a time until I get it as dark as I want it. So I'm going to have probably one half of my tree a little bit lighter where the sun's shining down on it, and a little bit darker where there's a shadow. For my grass, I just decided to do a green wash at first, so I'm covering the whole grassy area with just green. And then I'm going to go back in and add some yellow, and then I'm going to experiment with other ways to add texture to see how my values interact with this painting. So after I layered up my colors and my paint was nice and wet, I got a little bit of salt and sprinkled that salt on top of my watercolor. Now for this part, you need to make sure it's very wet or the salt won't stick and it won't make any difference really in your painting. But when your paint is nice and wet and fresh and you sprinkle some of that salt on top, it's going to leave really interesting texture marks and could play around with the value, leaving different light spaces and different dark spaces depending on where your salt landed. I needed to be very careful to keep my salt just in my grass because that was the only part that I wanted that bumpy texture that the salt provides. So if you decide to do that, make sure you're sticking to one area so that it doesn't just take over your whole painting and it all look the same. For my sky, I decided to do a technique called wet on wet. So I took my brush and got some clean water and painted that down first. Then I tapped on my blue paint, and I took the lot of blue paint that was on my brush and just tapped it onto the water puddle that I created. And that's going to create some really cool effects where the paint spreads out into the water. I did this in my whole sky using some blues and some purples to give it almost like a sunset kind of feeling. After I filled up my whole sky, I knew I wanted to play around with some more experimenting, so I used some rubbing alcohol to create a fun texture in the background. At first, I thought that it would work to take my bottle and squeeze the rubbing alcohol onto my painting, but that seemed to be too much and it took over my paint. Then I tried to dip a paper towel in and squeeze that on top of my painting, and that wasn't enough. So I grabbed a paintbrush and just tapped my paintbrush with the rubbing alcohol right above where I wanted it to sit, and it created really interesting effects that were almost like the resist with our glue and almost like the resist with the salt, where the watercolor kind of ran away from the alcohol, creating a really cool, almost galaxy-like texture in my background that'll be really interesting when I go to trace out my values. Once your painting is finished and you feel like you've created a wide variety of values, so you have a lot of lights and a lot of darks within all of your colors, then you can take your artwork over to the drying rack and let it dry so that we can move on to identifying those values with our Sharpies next class.